You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
Welcome back, everyone, to episode 35 of Arsenal Pass. I'm Brendan Patrick, joined always by culling champion Hayden Dale. Hayden, how are you doing?
Not good, Brendan. No, I'm not good. No, I'm fine. I just wanted to change it up because I always say that I'm good. How are you? So bit of a swap up. No, I'm still good.
You're still good. That's weird. I think that your answer has been the exact same for 35 weeks in a row now.
I had one off week, I think.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, but I'm better now.
Well, anyway, so this week we're going to be talking about the role of equipment. Flesh and blood. No fancy intro today because we are talking about a core topic, right? This is something that's going to go in Arsenal Pass's sort of Rolodex, right? This is one of our core episodes you can come back to. We'll try to future-proof it as much as possible, but equipment is a really interesting part of Flesh and Blood, right? We have a persistent board state, something that is not very common, Until Mechanologist came out, it was almost completely uncommon, right? You had the potions, that was about it. And so I think equipment has just changed Flesh and Blood and will continue to do so as some of the most impactful cards in the game. But anyway, like I said, we weren't going to have an introduction on
does
it
anyway.
And then introed it. Hey, let's talk about this week in Flesh and Blood. Or, I almost forgot, how was your week in Flesh and Blood, sir?
Yeah, I've had a good week. I haven't been, the last 3 weeks been pretty chaotic just with work and life, so I haven't been getting to armories. Usually I try and get to an armory a week. But I have managed to get to some drafts. So Australian Nationals is happening end of January, which is fantastic. It's going to be Tales of Aria draft plus class constructed. So I've had the opportunity to get some drafts, which has been good practice because just through lockdown, etc., I haven't actually been able to draft that much at all. I think I've done maybe less than half a dozen drafts before sort of 2 or 3 weeks ago. So yeah, in the past few weeks, done another half a dozen drafts, and it's been nice. Draft is probably my favorite format. I think in fact it definitely is, and I do like the Tales of Aria draft format. It's not, it's probably Welcome to Wraith and then Tales of Aria have been the two draft formats I've enjoyed the most. So I think there's a lot of depth to it. Been trying a few different strategies and things like that, and yeah, just been enjoying it. How about yourself? How's your week in Flesh and Blood?
It was like the first week I have taken off, I think, since we started Arsenal Pass. I didn't take off the entire week. I took off like 5 days. And it was a bit out of my power, unfortunately. But yeah, I actually haven't been playing Flesh and Blood. This morning was like the first morning I played in, a long time, it seems like. But it's all good, Can kind of jump right back into it. Luckily, it's off season, so I didn't sacrifice too much. But it's weird. It's weird not to be playing Hayden.
Hey, it might be off season for you. Some of us still have a national championship to look forward to.
Win.
Yeah. But anyway. We've got some news on OP, so should we jump into some news?
Yeah, and I feel like somebody was rubbling their crystal ball and predicted this because I think we've been calling this for months on this show.
Yeah, so first item, we talked about this last week. I think we talked about it the week before as well. ProQuest Season 1 is now, well, actually it hasn't officially been announced, but we know that we're getting ProQuest Season 1 because stores have been sent a fact sheet, and stores have already started scheduling their events, and some stores have started putting it up. So we do know that ProQuest Season 1 is going to be happening from 19th of February till 13th of March, so a pretty tight window, 4 weeks basically of ProQuests. And these are going to be allotting the winner an invite, a PTI, to Pro Tour number 1. So these ProQuests are only going to give you a PTI that's usable for first Pro Tour, so you can't stack these ones. And unlike other previous PTIs that people get through, calling top 8s, nationals, ProQuest side events at callings, it's for a specific Pro Tour. So, and we did talk about this, I think, a few weeks ago when we talked about the community, when we were on the community hot seat pod, that we felt like this was going to happen, that these were going to be specific ProQuest PTI invites for Pro Tours, so basically feeder events, right, that we're getting. So we now have confirmed dates, and I think pretty cool just looking around like the fact sheet and what's happening. There's some really good, like prize support. So you have 7 cold foil adult heroes, plus a 1 random drop gold cold foil equipment or weapon. So weapon, interestingly.
Weapon.
Yeah, weapon.
What was that? Yeah. So what does that say? That either says we're getting legendary weapons in Everfest, or like, that's probably what it is. Let's be real. That's probably what it is. But more exciting, in my opinion, was like a gold cold foil, like Dawn Blade or something. That would be really cool. But I feel like it's just Everfest stuff.
Well, so these are, I think the big thing to note is that the ProQuest events at Callings, which is so far where, outside of Callings Callings, we've had gold foils, right? Nationals and winner of the ProQuest was getting a skull cap for the season, a gold foil skull cap.
Yeah.
It could very well be that we're going to see a change with this ProQuest feeder system coming up, that we see that these random gold foil drops are something different. So do they need to be legendaries? Don't know. Could they be Majestics, for instance? Who
I hope
knows?
so. That would be dope, right?
Yeah.
I hope so. That would also stop diluting the supply that exists in the world.
Exactly, because if you're thinking, okay, one random drop gold foil equipment, and I've heard that in some countries, even as New Zealand, obviously it's a big piece of the Flesh and Blood world, but I've heard that they have 7 ProQuests apparently. That was just something that I heard. I know in Australia there's at least a few, so you can pretty sizably. I don't know about Europe or the US, but I imagine there's going to be quite a few. You're going to start to, like as Brendan says, there's going to be pumping a lot of these gold foils, and so I think to maintain that, I guess that premium aspect of these ones that have come before us with the Welcome to Wraith legendary equipment, the Arcane legendary equipment, then of course Monarch. And have we seen Tales of Aria gold foils yet? I don't think so. Correct me if I'm wrong. But
I don't think so.
Yeah,
I haven't personally seen one.
Yeah. So like, what does that mean? So could we see like some Crucible Majestic? Could we see a gold foil Skeletor, or like a Dawn Blade 2 point? So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what that is. Also, so the winner's going to get that, then 7 cold foil adult heroes. Each kit will contain 1 of each from Monarch and Tales of Aria. So the last 2 sets, there'll be cold foil adult heroes for 8th through to 2nd. There's also 2 ProQuest playmats. I think those are meant to be maybe given out randomly, and then there's 2 People's Champion playmats, which I think go to the finalists, or the other way around. Sorry. So there's 2 playmats for the finalists, and then there's 2 playmats for the event. So
random.
Yep, and there's also 6 Wartune Herald extended out rainbow foil judge promos for judges. So there's kits for judges as well, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's something, right? We expected this. I did not expect gold, so that's interesting. I really hope. So if I can just put on my my cynical socks for a second.
Go on, Brendan.
One thing that I hope is please don't have these events be very small and limiting, because there is a lot of EV on the line, and I don't play for EV. I know that. I like to win events, but I really do. I really just play because I like the competitive aspect of it, and I like to play competitive events. But if we get into a situation where these events are small, and people can make them small, and there's such a high EV on it with these gold foils, that's going to be a bit unpleasant. So I really hope that these things are more open, and everybody can participate, and we can all play the game. And I hate to put that out there, but with how we've seen the North American Flesh and Blood scene kind of grow and experience its growing pains, this has been one of the biggest ones for me, and I really hope that when we have Pro Tour invites on the line, gold foils on the line, it's not going to be a factor. I really want everybody that wants to play to be able to play. Obviously, logistically impossible sometimes when you have a demand of 500 for a 60-player event, but I don't want to see stores that have the capability to host more players be going down to 16 or 8 or something, just so that they can kind of keep the PTI and the gold foil internal. I really don't want to see that, but I'm really excited. Outside of that, I just want to play more events. Back to Road to Nat seasons, grind it again, new city or new town like every weekend. That's fun. So I'm hoping we get something closer to Road to Nats, even more accessible than Road to Nats. And yeah, it's exciting. Everfest.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, so on that, I guess it's a few things, right? LSS have said that they are not, there's no cap in terms of it's going to be down to, I guess, each individual host or TO of these events. Even in the fact sheet, they say, like you are welcome to, obviously, grab an external hire of an event venue if need be, or you want to, depending on your players that you expect to have. I agree, right? Like it comes down to what the stores do at the end, and I think LSS need to work with stores to make sure that it's the best environment for players. Because there's also, like, on the flip side of that, you don't want to be cramming 64 players into a really tight space, for instance. So there's there's a middle ground to hit, and also a responsibility of like LSS and stores to find that best middle ground for players, I think. And at the end of the day, stores want to make money and run a business. So I think they're encouraged to have larger events, but it just it just depends. So yeah, no, I'm really excited. I think it's awesome that we're gonna, this is just around the corner in the new year, starting as we say in February. So it's like literally with the release of Everfest, and the format is classic constructed. So all of these will be classic constructed. So we're gonna get Everfest, and then 2 weeks later we're playing a new classic constructed format. So that's really exciting that this ProQuest season, basically kicks off the Everfest season, and then we, assume that we'll go into Pro Tour number 1, possibly after the release of the first, base set, the first, set of the new year. That's not a supplemental set, which will be interesting. So yeah, it looks like we're getting some announcements, and we're getting some pathways for that qualification process. So yeah, excited to play some, and Everfest just around the corner.
Yeah. We had a bit of an off season, but we're just going to be right back into it. I wonder if there's going to be a point in Flesh and Blood, whether it's next year in 2022 or in 2023, when there just like literally is no off season. Obviously, by that time, players will be kind of curating the events that they go to. You don't have to go to every single Road to Nats or every single ProQuest, but right now it's like we're just hitting the ground running all the time. It seems like so. It's exciting. A lot of stuff going on.
I know in other games, like if you were like a quote unquote like a grinder, right? You often didn't have a downtime in the year. Maybe this time, December, November, January, maybe. But it tended to be that you would run seasons into seasons. You could sometimes have like ProQuest style events or Road to National styles events. One at the end of a month, and then all of a sudden the next season is kicking off 3 weeks later, 2 weeks later. So it just depends on set releases, depends on how LSS are going to do it. But obviously, you have the callings as well, and they don't need to necessarily run synchronously with seasons. For instance, like you could do like a limited one, when a set releases before a constructed season starts, or you could still be doing one at the end of a season, etc., etc. So I think it's going to come down to how LSS want to structure the Pro Tours worlds, but then also what they want to do with their calling season. What they want to do, you've still got skirmishes as well, right? So you're still going to always have, I guess, events for stores to be running and things happening. But they also, I think they need to be careful of burnout, right? They need to be able to space those out. They don't want to inundate stores and overload them to the point where, they're running so many events that they start to get, I guess, diminishing returning of players for these events through burnout, things like that. So yeah, it'd be interesting. I mean, we had 3 skirmish seasons this year. Do we get another 3 next year, or is it just 2 because we have other things happening? Or looking forward to seeing what it kind of looks like. But it's coming around pretty quickly. And for those of us that still have a nationals to prepare for, in the meantime, kind of runs from a national straight into Everfest and then into this ProQuest season 1.
Yeah, well, speaking of Skirmish in season 3 wrapped up this past week, and shout out to all the people who tagged Hayden on Twitter and played the patented, innovative, groundbreaking Briar List.
So innovative.
So innovative. So you played a bit of Skirmish season 3. How was it, Hayden?
Yeah, I did, mainly because of draft, right? Like I was really keen to play these draft skirmishes, and I think they're just a lot more accessible now. More stores are hosting skirmishes. I guess the window it felt a bit tighter, but maybe it's not, just because there's more happening. I felt like I had the ability to go and play a couple. So I played 2 blitz skirmishes and a draft skirmish. Yeah, that's right. I would love to have played another draft one, but there was only one available to me locally. But yeah, it felt more like what it should. So season 1 and season 2, I think, felt very competitive because that was the only competitive events that were around. Also, most of those were run online. Season 1, I actually traveled to some because it was the only events we'd had in about 14-15 months for Flesh and Blood within Australia. So I actually traveled to three skirmishes in season 1, and that was an awesome experience to meet a lot of the local communities, Flesh and Blood communities in Australia. So I went across the country a couple of times. And then obviously season 3, it's a bit different, right? Just come back from Orlando at the calling, and there's a lot more of my local stores running these. So just got to go and just like almost like an armory plus, like the next stage up from an armory, which is what skirmish should be. It felt really sociable. It felt like the environment's really cool to play in. I guess the inception of the draft skirmish I thought was quite cool. Unfortunately, I think the store that had the draft skirmish here in Sydney, where I live, didn't maybe advertise the event, or there was some kind of miscommunication about how they were going to run the event, so that the turnout was quite low, which did kind of suck. I'd love to see those, around like 16 to 32 players, so that you get multiple pods and you kind of draft through. But no, otherwise I had like a really good time. I think the Blitz format is an interesting spot right now. I think we might get some changes coming with the band, and I guess the band announcement coming in I think it's the 14th of December. So just in a few days. Because I don't know, Dustblade felt like it kind of dominated this Blitz season.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't get to play Blitz this season, so I'm interested to see the ban announcement.
I
So
still had fun,
I
by the
really,
way. I still had a lot of fun.
Mhm.
Like I played Kano, I played Briar. Um,
Yeah, confirmed. Hayden hated Blitz. Yeah. Okay.
I actually enjoyed it, which is I haven't always enjoyed Blitz. I think Kano was kind of my revival of enjoying Blitz, and then also just playing into the season was it was good.
hmm
Did want to call out as well. We have a gameplay that's gone up for this week. It's Bravo versus Viscerai. Guardian is back. It's not old time this time. It is Bravo. Bit of a quicker game than last week's one, and a very interesting ending actually. So I do recommend going and checking that out up on the Arsenal Pass
Yeah.
YouTube. And
You can watch me pull a cat out of the hat on Hayden.
a cat out of the hat. I think it's a rabbit. Isn't that the same?
It's a monkey out of the box.
And last
Yeah,
thing,
but that was a crazy game. That was wild. That was pretty wild. It definitely looked like I was not doing well there for a while.
I don't think you were. Last thing I want to call out as well, before I hand it over to my co-host here, is that we are, and I did talk about this last week, we're at the end of the year. It's been a big year for Arsenal Pass, obviously our first year. It's been a wild sort of ride. Thank you to everyone who's supported us and continued to support us, whether that be through listening to our pods, our patrons, of course, and everyone who just sends us messages and questions and interacts with us. We love it and we appreciate it. As we head into 2022, we are looking about what our sort of content schedule looks like, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. So if you're on YouTube, drop in comments or tweet at us, send us an email, whatever you want to do. Any ideas or things that you'd love to see from us in 2022, because we're all ears to making sure that the content that we put out is the content that you want to see in here.
Yeah, I just love how the next few points here on our news section are just you making me do all the shilling.
Of
So
course.
I see my name, Brendan, and it's like, it's just hilarious. But mentioning YouTube, we are getting close to 3,000 subscribers. It's a big goal for us. If we can hit that in the year, that'd be amazing. So if you listen to our podcast, watch our YouTubes, or enjoy our content in any sort of medium, if you can choose a subscription on YouTube, we would greatly appreciate that. Also, our podcast, that is kind of our bread and butter, and I think that we have to move in the direction of SEO. So if you listen to our podcast on services such as Apple and you like it, if you could write us a review, that'd be awesome as well. We haven't really pushed for that before, but I'm sure it's really important. So shoot us a review and we will greatly appreciate it. So last week's time on the round was Jason Pokerface Long, the man who walks to every single calling in shorts and sandals and just top eights. He's a top eight machine, and he has some really good thoughts actually on what to expect in Everfest, and it's actually something I thought about. So go check it out. Really interesting guy, really cool guy, and amazing player as well. Finally, a shout out to all of the Arsenal Pass patrons, over 300 of you now, and the support has been incredible. Really, we can't put it into words. So thank you so much. If you are interested, the Arsenal Pass Patreon does have tons of extra content, including an extra pod each month, a live session, as well as if we do a deck tech on the Arsenal Pass channel, often there will be an entire sideboard guide added onto the Patreon as well. Anyway, Hayden, do you smell that? Smell that? Something burning? Oh, looks like the Commander Cookout section is back. Let's head over to the grill.
It's never burning while I'm on the grill, Brendan. It's always perfect. I'm not running a dad grill over here where it's about 2 minutes too long. This is.
I bet you order your steak medium well. You seem like that kind of guy. Well done.
Because you've been with me at a steak restaurant that I don't eat beef. But if I did,
if you did, you'd just be like burn it like a shoe.
No, it'd be medium rare, definitely. Anyway, Commander Cookout is back this week, but I have annexed a question this week. So Brendan was on the Attack Action podcast this week with our good friends Taylor and Isaac, the Battle Bros, the Falcon of the West with the Falcon of the South, as it were, the Prince of Precision, Isaac himself as well, recent Nationals top eighter. And I know they had some Twitter questions for you, but I think they ran out of time. So you know what, Brendan? I've decided to steal one of these questions that I saw tweeted at them for you, Brendan, because I think it's a great question. It comes from Zane Johnson. Zane asks you, Brendan, how would you describe your improvement that takes place through your daily testing? Do you feel like you get incrementally better daily, or do you find small breakthroughs over time? As someone who plays far less than they want to, I'm curious how you see it.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think that what is most true is the inverse of this. I find myself getting incrementally worse if I don't play every day. So a lot of it is just maintaining. I think that it's a muscle and you got to kind of work it every day or work it as often as you can. And that's how you really develop, your 10,000 hours and move towards being an expert at something. do I have small breakthroughs or big breakthroughs? It's definitely small breakthroughs, right? It's pretty uncommon that, one day we're just going to be playing and then I have this epiphany and I've this incredible improvement in Flesh and Blood and how I just fundamentally play. That definitely is unlikely. But it's more just the repetition, associating myself with good players that are highly motivated, and I just kind of get better over time, I feel, without really noticing it, right? But the main reason I do the everyday testing is to just not get worse. For me, that's kind of how it works. I feel like, if I don't play or if I become complacent, just take a few days off here, take a few days off there, eventually that kind of, it's okay one or two times, but then it kind of snowballs into something else and you find that, you're not really staying up to date and maybe getting worse at the game. So just mostly maintaining for me. And then I think that the people that I surround myself with allow me to make improvements, even when they're not very visually apparent, I guess, or to me during the time. They're kind of just, over a long period of time, I just aggregate all these improvements and I think, and at the end of the tunnel become a better player. As weird as that description was, I hope it made sense.
Well, I don't know if Zane listens to the pod, and Zane, I know if you do, this question wasn't for me, but I'm going to jump in here.
He definitely does, by the way. I saw he commented on your thing on Twitter because you're like, yeah, I might have to use this for the Command and Cookout section. His reply was, "Fire up the grill."
Oh, okay,
okay.
He
listens, yeah.
Yeah. I think it came from the Arsenal Pass Twitter. Thanks to Chase, but yeah, I'm a bit different to Brendan. I think that if I don't play for a while, I can probably maintain my level of play. But Flesh and Blood is quite an interesting thing where a lot of you can have base levels of skill, I think, in terms of your ability to play certain things. And good players can often pick up decks and sort of run them, 70-80% proficiently cold, because they just have an understanding of the game, how patterns happen, how to, use and swing and create tempo. But then outside of that, a lot of especially in the current class constructor format, I think there's a lot of intricacies with decks in this format. And I think that's going to continue. It was maybe less so in previous formats, but there's a lot of edges to be gained in the way that you exploit and use play patterns, the game plans that you enact. And so I think if you're not actually testing these or practicing or as Brendan said, getting repetitions in with these, I think what you'll find is that sometimes you'll pick up these decks and you won't get the success that you might find as a good player or as whatever player the level you're at, had you been putting in some reps. So I think there's a piece around like core fundamentals and how your game improves there, and then there's also this piece around just knowledge of the format, knowledge of how to play decks, and that's a piece where I think that personally for me, like the practice and the testing side really pays dividends the most. Is that I understand those play patterns in those decks. It's the same with limited actually as well. Like I think I have core fundamentals, but the more I sort of get in drafts or get in sealed and play games, the more sort of things I'll pick up from that format. And then I kind of tuck those away, and then they're always kind of with me. But then the fundamental side, I think, that definitely comes through, practice and testing. But a big one for me, actually, is that comes through playing events. Because I think that's where, and this is probably to my detriment, but often playing in events, I can tune into that. I find it maybe sometimes harder to tune into practice and to testing as well as I do an event. And I find that if I play, say, The Calling, a few weeks ago, for me, that probably gives me as much as a week or two of testing in terms of my fundamentals, because I tend to be playing a lot tighter. I'm really considering my plays after the matches as well, and just thinking back about like how I could have played those better. In testing, I'm often trying to get data, so I'm less focused on that. So I did just want to talk about that. I think it's a little bit different for me. And then in terms of like small versus big breakthroughs, I think big breakthroughs come in terms of like testing information. So sometimes we'll have like these breakthroughs that come through of like, oh, someone worked this thing out, or we tested this and now we realize that this is how you should play the matchup. And that's quite a big breakthrough. Whereas the smaller breakthroughs, I think for me, like the fundamentals, just getting a little bit tighter each time, finding lines of play that maybe I have known about but wasn't practicing and couldn't execute very well on. So like, I mean, a good one could be like pitch stacking, right? The more I do that, I think the better I get at it. So yeah, I think it's a bit of it's a complicated topic, I think, in terms of like how you get better at the game, because I think there's a few different areas of the game that you can improve in.
Absolutely. It's interesting to hear that because, I agree as well. I mean, high level events definitely push you to really focus on getting better, where I guess it's almost impossible to avoid some of the complacency that happens in testing, where like you lose and you maybe don't reflect on it as much as if you were kind of in the finals and very attached to winning, a big match where you look back and you analyze every little play. Where in testing, sometimes it's just like, all right, next game, take the notes, next game, which is, I think it's natural that probably everyone does that. But all right, Hayden, let's talk about equipment.
Yeah, let's move into the main topic of the pod this week. Brendan talked about it and then didn't expand on it because he didn't want a long, lengthy intro, and then he made one anyway at the top of the show about the importance of equipment in Flesh and Blood. So this really will serve, I think, as a foundational piece in, I guess, I'm going to call it the Arsenal Pass Armory, of our equipment pod. We're going to take a bit of a journey through what makes equipment, I guess, special, why it's important to play the right pieces, and why it can be detrimental to play the incorrect ones, how to choose the best pieces to play, and how to, get the leverage, and basically a bit more about just, I think, understanding equipment in Flesh and Blood, because I think for often it's something that we take for granted. Like we start with equipment, and that is part of the game, and it is, and that's one of the reasons why it's so important, is that it's a big design philosophy of Flesh and Blood is this, you start full and you come down from there. Whereas a lot of other games, you build up your resources. Whereas in Flesh and Blood, you're walking into battle, you've got your equipment, you've got your weapon, you've got your deck ready to go, right? And as the game goes, that gets depleted. You start running through your threats, you start defending with your equipment or using them, and then you start to run out. So that is a big point about what makes Flesh and Blood unique. And it's a big piece of the design philosophy as well, and I think that's really important to keep in mind when we talk about equipment, right, Brendan? Because if I think if you isolate equipment by itself, that can often get you into trouble where you just think about equipment in isolation, and equipment really isn't isolated when it comes to playing Flesh and Blood, right?
No, definitely not. But I don't think that anything is isolated in Flesh and Blood, right? So equipment obeys that rule as well. Equipment is interesting because like you said, it can just fundamentally change the way that you play the game. We see a lot of core pieces, like something like Mask of Momentum. A lot of the ninja decks are, I would say, virtually all the ninja decks are built around actually utilizing that piece of equipment. While some classes do have, ones that play lesser roles, it's just interesting to see how the strategies can warp around just one piece of armor. But that's the power of a persistent board state that sticks around through the entire game, or as long as you let it stick around.
Exactly, which I think is so. You talk about things not being in isolation in Flesh and Blood, and I agree. The synergistic nature of the game, the modal function of cards in the game. I guess the one thing that's so unique with equipment is that you start with it and play. So you always have that opportunity to leverage that equipment from turn 0, turn 1, through, for as long as you have it, or as long as the game goes, depending on what equipment it is. I think that's an important piece of, I guess, trying to understand equipment is what is your equipment's role? It's, like you said before, it can supplement your game plan. So, it could be to a Mask of Momentum, which could radically if you have a Mask of Momentum versus if you don't have Mask of Momentum in your ninja deck, that radically changes what your game plan is. And also it's going to change how your opponent plays. But, it could be defensive. It could be a one-time use. You've got things like Snapdragon Scalers, pretty iconic at this point, a one-time use thing. And it's about finding the right time in the game to use that piece. Whereas it could be a bit more I guess, build around esque, a Skeletor, right? Bloodsheath Skeletor. When's the right time to use this? It's
also one-time use, yeah.
Yeah, one-time use, but very fundamental to playing. So Snapdragon Scalers is probably going to be, in a lot of cases, a lot more opportunistic and just gets used on the correct turn, or a turn where you can get a bit of incremental damage, or it allows you to play a snatch on the end of a chain or something because you give another attack go again. Whereas something like a Bloodsheath Skeletor, right? You're probably building towards that. You're probably looking for some sort of specific turn where you get an attack action and a non-attack action, or even if you talk about Courage of Bladehold, right? You're looking for probably a bit more of a specific setup turn with that in regard, and that might not always be the case. It might just be the best turn you can find. But I think in varying cases, it's about understanding that, whether you're just kind of using this piece of equipment because it's good and you want to get some extra advantage out of it, maybe like a Goliath Gauntlet. I just want to get the 2 damage out of it somewhere. Or it could be no, actually, this Goliath Gauntlet is here to pair with my Command and Conquer so that I can push my Command and Conquer to a breakpoint that requires, more than 2 cards to defend it out.
Yeah, or it can just be defensive, right? So, Arcanite Skullcap obviously has another, words printed on it to interact with arcane damage, but a lot of times it's not used for that at all, right? The Arcane Barrier 3. And there's also things like Chrono Dichotomy, which has Arcane Barrier 1 on it, but, you're playing it in Runeblade, you often, depending on which Runeblade deck you're playing, you may never actually be using the ability that's printed on it. So it's there is armor that you play that is there purely for the defensive value.
Yeah, and I want to talk more about just how you leverage that, like how you first of all you find out like what is the role of your equipment. I think that's massive. How you want to use it, how you game plan around it. There's so many considerations I think when you look at a piece of equipment, and on the surface level, it's like, well, a lot of the time we take for granted what equipment decks should play, and I actually think it's something that I know we've talked about in our testing a lot recently. Is like we just often say like, oh, well, you play the standard, Brendan's favorite, you play the standard or whatever it is for this deck. But sometimes, if the game plan starts to shift, and Blitz is a really good example of this, where you have access to more equipment, that's basically your sideboard, right? That, you need to be more strategic about where you use your equipment. And I think for me, this happened during the Blitz season playing Briar. It's not like I played Briar. I played Briar for 2 weeks. But building the deck and putting it together, it was like, how do I best use my equipment to help facilitate matchups that are difficult for me or change the game plan of the deck? And that's where, like, playing Spell Void 4 came from. Was like, okay, there's access to this equipment. It has a really specific role that I want to assign in my deck. And then that kind of just came about where it's like, okay, Shock Charmers, Spellfray Cloak, Spellfray Boots, and a Null Rune Head going, for instance, because that's a plan. So equipment has this like role, and I think often we just kind of take it for granted, or it's just kind of assumed that these are the equipment pieces you play. And I want to dive into that. But first, Brendan, I want to talk about just the history of equipment, because I think it's really fascinating. And if you are a player who is newer to the game, whenever you're listening to this, whether it be, you've jumped in at Tales of Aria, Monarch even, or maybe you got in at Crucible, or you're getting in post Everfest and other sets as they come out. Equipment has really changed. It's never been one-dimensional.
I mean, you just have so many choices nowadays, and almost everything actually is like has some sort of additional text on it that you're using. I mean, if we go back to you said like the history, go back to Welcome to Wraith and even Arcane Rising to an extent, we were still playing Iron Rot armor, I know it sounds bad, but like it was pretty good back then, right? That's stopping a breakpoint, or something of that nature. But back then, the most popular equipment, still one of the most popular today, was definitely Fyendal Spring Tunic. There was a lot of decks, that would utilize things like Heart and Cross Trap as well as a sort of derivative from that. And every class really had their key piece of equipment back in Welcome to Wraith as well, right? You had Brute with the Scabskin Leathers, Ninja with the Mask of Momentum, Warrior with Brave Forge Bracers, and of course Guardian with Tectonic Plating. I think Tectonic Plating was probably the most underwhelming one, just because it took up the same slot as the Tunic, which almost everybody was universally playing in that format. But like I said, the rest of your slots outside your Legendary and outside the Tunic were sometimes slightly underwhelming. Obviously, we still had Snapdragon Scalers, but a lot of times you would see Iron Rot on those other slots.
Yep. And I think great point. The power of those legendary equipments, that really was, I think, LSS signaling how important equipment is in the base set. So Welcome to Wraith you have as an introduction to the game, and like you say, most of the equipment slots pretty underwhelming. You have Iron Rots, you have really, I guess, single-use equipment for the most part, right? So you have these either Iron Rot, one-time defense, you have Goliath Gauntlet, one-time power pump, chest piece, one-time, resource, and then Hope Merchant's Hood, for instance, this one-time sort of manipulation of the hand and the deck. And those, I think, are actually really fundamental. If you look at them now, thinking back to them, they really pointed to what we were going to get for the rest of Flesh and Blood as that started to develop, the idea of what those pieces did. You look at, feet are about, action points and speed of attack and things like that. The chess piece is really around resources, etc. Head piece around manipulation and card draw, and we started to see that. But then the legendary equipment outside of those just common pieces really, really core to a lot of the strategy that those decks implemented. And I think that was LSS saying, okay, here's legendary equipment. We're telling you how important equipment is because you can see what Mask of Momentum does, and you can see how you build game plans around that. And that is what our equipment in this game is about. It's about being one and the same with the deck. It's about the synergy of how it works with the deck. These equipment aren't just on the side, and they do. Imagine if you had the first Welcome to Wraith set come out, and you just have the common and it was just common equipment at the time, no rare equipment. No majestic equipment. And it's just Iron Rot plus, I don't know, maybe a Snapdragon Scales. You'd probably look at your equipment in isolation a lot and be like, yeah, this is just to the side. This is something that sometimes I get to defend with this when I need it, or I get this extra action point at one time when I need it. But when you see the legendary equipment, you look at it and you go, oh, I can build a deck around this. I can build a strategy around what this card does. I'm not saying I have to. I don't have to do that, but I can.
Hayden, that's actually so funny that you mentioned kind of the breakdown of the boots and the chest and the head, because I have never thought about it that way.
Oh, really?
And
I'm
that
glad we
is
did it.
absolutely true. Because like it's just blowing my mind as I'm thinking through everything. I'm like, wow, every chess piece is about resource generation. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I just like I guess in the peripheral, I just never noticed that as a core design, but it's absolutely true. And I guess arms are kind of around like some sort of damage manipulation, whether it's a bonus or adding some kind of damage. I think that I'm looking at Code of Frost here, which I don't think really aligns with that, but
It
it looks
does.
like the
It's
it
it's
does.
about resource. It's about resource
Yeah.
manipulation, and that way it's in resource taxing, right? So it's slightly different to something like a Hope Merchant's Hood, but it's on the flip side. So I might just recap that before we kind of do it, because I think it's really interesting, and I'm glad you
Yeah.
want to dive into it. But so just to recap, the I guess the design we've seen in Flesh and Blood so far, and it really feels like this is the design philosophy, and it's not going to change. Hit Pieces is about card and deck manipulation. So you see card draw effects there. You see if any effects that have to interact with like your deck. So you've got like Skullhorn and Brute, for instance. Then at the chess piece, you've got resource related pieces and manipulation. So the tunic, you've got tectonic plating, you've got the hardened cross straps, or the Brute one, the backbone strapping, for instance, at a class level. And then legs is about the speed of play. So actions, you've got Snapdragon Scalers, you've got Scabskin Leathers, you've got the Spellbound Creepers, for instance. These are all around that sort of piece. Mage Master Boots, right? And then at the arm piece, like you say, it tends to be about like manipulating either like the combat chain, the attacks. So you've got Braces of Belief, you've got Goliath Gauntlets. But then we also have, outside of those 4 pieces and kind of the philosophy of what those pieces could do, then you just have defensive items as well. So you have the Iron Rot, you have the Iron Hide, and then you have the Null Rune, of course, as well. So all of those slots have a defensive piece for arcane and physical damage.
Yeah, it's so cool to see that, because like I just had never noticed that, and it's so apparent. I wonder if anybody at home was kind of in that boat with me, but it's so blatantly obvious once you look at it. But yeah, I mean that definitely, that's very in line with Legend Story Studios. Everything's kind of built for scale and built on sort of an equation. And
Yeah.
blew
I'm
my
glad you're
mind
finding this out. I like that we're hearing this live, Brendan finding this out. So I'm sure there's some listeners who maybe didn't know that as well, and are learning about that. So yeah, it's great. And then you look at, I guess, just talking about the history of the equipment. So we started with Welcome to Wraith, like we say, those legendaries that really signposted what a class could do, how you could build around equipments, plus just really solid defensive pieces with Iron Rot, and then plus a generic slot for each that could do something a bit different, that showed those principles off. And then we move into Arcane Rising, and you get an extension of this, right? You get things that are a little bit more complicated. So you get a bit of a step up. You get the Mage Master Boots, for instance. There's a few more steps in between, right? But potentially has maybe higher power. You get the Braces of Belief. It's a bit more around build around this time. It's not just like, okay, I crack my Goliath Gauntlets on any old thing that costs 2 or more and I get the buff. Now it's like, well, I really want to see a red card on top of my deck to get the most out of this. So how do I manipulate my deck maybe to do that? And you had opt cards, right? So you saw again, even at common, the equipment really start to play in with the cards in the set. And then legendaries, of course, continue on the same way. You get one for each of the classes. I guess the one that people might say, how does that kind of work, is like the Grasp of the Arknight, where it's a defensive piece and makes rune chants. That one's kind of interesting in the scope of like what the design philosophy is. But the rest kind of seem to fit in pretty well.
Yeah, I was thinking about Grasp of the Arknight as well. I guess because adding an additional rune chant,
it's damage,
some sort of damage manipulation. But it's interesting in Runeblade because it's resource reduction a lot of the time as well.
Kind of does 2 things at once. So I guess the mold for Arcane Rising really follows the mold for Welcome to Wraith in terms of equipment. You get there's a bit more happening. You start to interact. LSS is saying, hey, look, you really can build around these, and there's some things happening with the cards in the set, like we talked about, Opt and Braces of Belief, and that is important to know. And then of course we get Null Rune. We get that added piece that comes on top of not having arcane damage before and now having arcane damage. And then we move into Crucible, right? And then this is where things get crazy.
Wild. Yeah. Crucible and Everfest. I'll just call it right now Everfest as well, which is not out at the time of this recording, but the same kind of thing. This is really, they really give us the tools in the toolbox to let us have fun. Because this is where you see kind of these pieces of armor that just allow you to do so much more with your class. Like if we think back to Kano or Wizard, right? Metacarpus nodes.
Mhm.
It's just an unbelievable card for like this boosting of damage, right? Like, allows things like Aether Flare, Forked Lightning, all these cards to really realize their full potential. And we saw this with a lot of pieces as well, right, Hayden? So like Courage of Bladehold, just an incredibly integral piece. Yep. I mean, Bloodsheath Skeleta. Yeah, I mean, that one just being kind of the core armor piece of a lot of Runeblade strategies at this point. It allowed it allowed a lot of classes to kind of develop new archetypes as well. Like, speaking of Bloodsheath Skeleta, like that birthed new Runeblade archetypes. Like this OTK or this combo version is really comes out of Skeleta.
Yeah, and even some of the lesser played pieces and lesser known at this point, Visiertronic, right? That allowed this boost sort of build of Dash to really flourish. You get this like 1 turn big setup, right? Where you get to choose the cards you put back in boost and then draw. Was really important. Skullhorn for, and maybe Skullhorn's been the least sort of explored, but Skullhorn for Brute. In terms of that,
it's got the barrier on it though, which is pretty important.
Pretty important, yeah.
and everybody's favorite, by the way, too. Before you mentioned Gambler's Gloves, which I know, I mean now that's a good game theory one, but everybody's favorite, and I'm actually kind of disappointed you forgot to mention it. Perch Grapplers. What an addition for all of our Ranger players, even our resident 3-month in the tank Ranger champion Hayden Dale. Perch Grapplers.
Well,
that's what started your journey, wasn't it? Perch Grapplers came out, you're like, I got to play those bad boys.
I think Remorseless came out, but but you're also forgetting Breeze Rider Boots, so doing the ninjas dirty as well. But those were those are good examples of one-time use pieces that can really, like, all of those pieces are one-time use. But Alice was saying, hey, look, we showed you in Arcane Rising that you have your deck can really interact with your equipment. I will use the Brave Forge, Braces of Belief example again. But now, look at this. Now you can build game plans around this, and you can set them up and just get huge value out of your equipment. These are definitely no longer siloed pieces off to the side on the left-hand side of your play area, or right-hand side if you're left-handed, I guess, if you want to line it up that way. But these are really important, and really you need to consider these in the way that you design decks and the way that you play your game plans out. So, from every class.
I do think that equipment has the biggest impact on the game, right? That's why when we see these supplemental sets, they change the sort of meta of Classic Constructed so drastically. Like when Crucible of War or something like Everfest comes out is really when we see the biggest changing of the guard in terms of, not maybe the top deck, but the evolution of archetypes in a certain class. Like the diversity of that expands quite a bit because a single piece of armor, because it's a persistent board state, can fundamentally allow for an entirely new archetype to exist. By the way, just quick history lesson as well. So I did interrupt you, Hayden, before you talked about Gambler's Gloves, which is a very interesting card. I know that LSS did have to clarify that you could not pop Gambler's Gloves on the roll to see who goes first, or who gets to choose.
Yeah. Well, it's not currently in the game, so
Yeah, of course. I mean, of course. But I know that, for a while there in Crucible, people are like, okay, pop my Gambler's Gloves, reroll.
Yeah, it's like if you've ever played Magic, you like Powder Keg, it was called. Yeah. I guess no, I don't know. There's a card in Magic that allowed you to basically mulligan at the start of the game, and there's a whole lot of shenanigans. But anyway, aside from that, the equipment is, by the time we get to Crucible, it's becoming apparent just how crucial equipment is. And you made a good point about how it changes the way that decks are designed, the meta even. And do you know what? I think we would have seen bigger meta shifts with Crucible of War when that first came out, but the game was still small. And it really took a lot of time for some of those equipment to be realized. Skeleta, a lot of hype when it was spoiled and came out, but we didn't really see much Viserai at the time. And then we start to see Skeleta really come into its own in the first Blitz season with the OTK deck, and then now into Classic Constructed at the time of recording. So yeah, and it tells you a lot about what a deck is trying to do. So if you sit down across from a Viserai and they flip a Tunic versus they flip Skeleta, two very different things are going to happen in those games, very likely, right? So to that point about what it means for the way that decks are designed and played out, it's huge. It's the same with Courage of Bladehold. If they flip that over versus if they flip Tunic, it's probably
that's what I was just going to say.
Yeah,
it tells you a lot about the potential one-cost defense reactions they might have in their deck. But yeah, I mean, For me, this is the most exciting part of Flesh and Blood is when we get this large influx of new armor because that I feel like that's when the developers are telling us a story of how we can potentially play this game. They give us the tools, and then we're able to kind of expand on what we know and build like fundamentally new archetypes and new decks.
Definitely, you use it as a. I love the idea like telling a story because that's literally what it is. But you think, okay, if I'm trying to build a strategy, right, and I have a card in my deck, and I need three cards to like pull together. So maybe I'm playing Dorinthia, right? And it's like, okay, I really want to like set up Iron Song Determination, Steelblade Supremacy turns with like a Singing Steelblade. Like this is the devastation. Like this turn is just going to be phenomenal. Well, what if I could just have one of those cards in play already? Like what if I had one of those effects on an equipment? And that's literally what you get. I mean, not that example specifically, but let's say, okay, I want to have this like ninja combo deck. But I need like a time snap potion in order to give my attack go again. Well, actually, I have Breeze Rider boots, and I can just set it up that way. So you have these, or it's like Perch Grapplers for Ranger or whatever. Or I don't need 2 E potions in play because I have Bloodsheath Skalata or I have the Courage of Bladehold that does that job for me. So the equipment is like, you can come up with these really grand designs and these ideas for decks, and then you just get to have that equipment in play. You get to have that piece of your strategy or your combo, or whatever you want to call it, depending on what you're building, there in play for the whole game. You get to always have that available to you, and I think that is just one of the coolest things about what we saw with Crucible. And prior to that, there were ongoing effects. So Mask Momentum, Tectonic Plating, Brave Forge Braces, Scabskin Leathers, those were ongoing effects, and then Crucible was like, no, hold on. Here's one-time effects, here's build-around effects at Majestic.
Yeah, absolutely. What if I could lock you in for a quick speculation? This is meant to be future-proof, but I just want to get it for now, Hayden. What do you think that the armor suite that we get in Everfest will be? Will it be a sort of one-time effect kind of thing, or are we going to take it into a different design space?
Such a good question. I think we see something different. I don't think we see just functional, I guess, or very similar things to Crucible. We could, because you have a lot of new classes and heroes since Crucible came out, but I think probably what we see is something different again, which is exciting. Whether that's like not straight one-time use, maybe it's like multiple. We saw Temper right come in instead of Blade Break. We saw 2-time uses of defensive equipment. Do we see that with effects? Could there be a keyword that allows you to use a certain effect so many times, like it starts the game with charge counters or something and then loses them, and you get to use something twice or whatever it might be. I wouldn't be surprised if we see something like that, to be honest. Something it's a departure from what we've seen so far. It's somewhere between a consistent effect like a Scabskin Leathers or a Tectonic Plating, and between a one-off effect like a Skalata or a Breeze Rider Boots.
Yeah, I've designed this card. It's going to be a gloves, or it's actually going to be a hood, and it's going to be called Hayden's Remorse. It's going to be 1 action point, shuffle your opponent's deck.
I'm glad you know which slot to put it in, because you were going to try and put the arm slot, and it wouldn't have worked. But if we didn't have that discussion earlier, you wouldn't have known what slot to put it in. So there we go. I like it. If you could mock up some art for me and send that across, that'd be great. Anyway, so we get Crucible, and then things like slow down a little bit. We get some more templated equipment for our new heroes in Monarch and Tales of Aria that are similar to what we've seen previously. We see some. We go back to some consistent effects with our legendaries, right? So you think about Phantasmal Footsteps or Crown of Seeds, cards like these, right? We get back to some more consistent pieces, Vestige of Soul. So it's probably, you could say, just going back to your question before, once we get to Everfest, that maybe we could have more one-time effects, more build-around effects that are sort of a punch as opposed to sort of small jabs, because that's what we kind of have with these consistent equipment, right? It's just like small jabs. They help out your turns as you go through a game, and then these Majestic equipment that we got with Crucible are just like these haymakers. So yeah, we could see that. So, and then we get Spell Void, which is another keyword that comes in.
Which is really interesting actually, because it when it came out, it really felt like it was there for the limited format. It was because Runeblade was in the set.
Yep.
And that seemed like its only use case, but we've seen Spell Void utilized in constructed formats. And a little man I know in Australia named Hayden Dale was actually running full Spell Void in their Briar list. But it's interesting to watch it expand to that, right? Like you're playing cards that we would have actually thought never would have been played outside of draft.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, funny story. I actually had to open some pre-con decks to find those spell-free items.
You have to, yeah. That's the only place you can get them, right?
Yeah, because they're not actually in the set. So no, and then you saw Spell Void on Legendary as well in the form of Shock Charmers. So yeah, really interesting the way that equipment is developed. And then you just kind of go, okay, what's next? Like we had a very, I guess, a bit more template with Tales of Aria in terms of those the equipment. Some of the keywords we'd all seen previously, right? But maybe things change, or maybe Everfest is like a realization of some of these, but on the Majestic equipment. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what happens. So I guess that's kind of the history of equipment, and it gives us a bit of a platform to discuss some of the importance or some of the ways to really leverage equipment. And I think we're talking about obviously constructed mostly, but we'll touch a little bit on limited. But in class constructed, I wanted to ask you this question first, Brendan. Is like, why are legendaries so impactful to the way that we build and construct decks and strategies currently? Do you think that's something that's always going to be the case? I know we've talked about this before. We can play. There's always budget options there to use, but do you think this is something that it's just because of the design philosophy of the game that you just are never going to be able to get away from how important legendary equipments are?
Well, I don't think it has much to do with legendaries. Like, yeah, it is easy to look at Mask Momentum and be like, yeah, all the ninja decks are kind of built around utilizing this card, or at least most of them are. But then a lot of decks are built around like Snapdragon Scalers at a pretty key time. So it's an interesting idea. I think that the reason why these things are so important is, yeah, I mean, most of it is their rarity, I guess, or some of it is their rarity. If you look at the common equipment, a lot of the legendary equipment does kind of eclipse some of the common stuff. But the main reason that it's so important is because it's equipment, because it's a persistent board state. Like, if it was just an individual card in your deck, it doesn't even come close to the relevance of it being on the board 100% of the time. It starts on the board, and then you're always going to have, that card available to use in every single game. So effectively zero variance on it. Do I think we'll move away from it? I do think so. We have seen some very good common pieces of equipment come in and be able to sub out some of those legendary pieces already, right? Like, the most famous case, and the earliest case actually, is playing Heart and Crossed Up instead of Fiendal Spring Tunic, which a lot of the times, and especially in Blitz, was actually the correct decision. But even in Welcome to Wraith, you would see people play the Heart and Crossed Up over the Tunic.
Yeah, or the previous format, which is a really quick, aggressive format, like Ninja decks, for instance, playing the Heart and Crossed Up. So that leads me to another question I have for you, Brendan. Are commons and rare equipment underplayed in Classic Constructed, or in Blitz even?
Yeah, definitely. I think less so now. People are starting to realize that the cards are, that the rarity is a little bit less important. That, things like Heart and Cross Up, which I'm kind of going to keep calling on, are very good. But I definitely think that fundamentally they probably are underplayed. It's just the easiest use case for me to call back to is Fiendal Spring Tunic, right? That card was criminally overplayed. Well, its derivatives, that and Vest of the First Fist and Heart and Cross Up, were extremely underappreciated in previous formats, but we saw the realization of those cards in faster formats like Monarch, like you said.
Yeah, I think there's a few pieces that have been underplayed, and I think it's because it's we just go back to this. Well, you play this, and this is why you play it, and because you have these strong options, rather than. And this is something I want to touch on: is that equipment is really about trying to find the right piece for the right time and the right matchups. And I want to use an example, and that is Iron Rock Gauntlet. So there's a lot of classes that don't have access to defensive equipment in the arm slot, right? Mm-hmm. They don't have a Grasp of the Arknight. They don't have a Brave Forge Braces. They don't have this way to, have basically 3 defense, 2 and then 1. And there's matchups where you may want that defensive piece. And so Iron Rock Gauntlet could actually be a really important piece of equipment for you. But often it kind of just gets overlooked because, well, it's not as powerful as maybe like a class-specific one. Maybe I could try and do something with Shock Charmers in a Lightning deck, or maybe I could, try and I could play Glyph Gauntlets or Gambler's Gloves in a Brute deck, and I could use those two to try and push some damage. But if you think about, I guess, the way you design a deck or the way you play out your game plans, if you're playing, to maybe stop a deck that has breakpoints or things like that, a piece of Iron Rock Gauntlet could be like just worth the whole card. Because if you say you have a deck that's attacking you with on-hit effects, and you're playing sort of a semi-defensive strategy, or you need to defend some points in the game, and you're playing a Brute, so a card plus an Iron Rock could stop something like a Snatch or a Meet and Greet, or these cards that have breakpoints, important breakpoints. as opposed to maybe something like a Gambler's Gloves or a Goliath Gauntlet. Yeah, Goliath Gauntlet can create breakpoints, but you don't have many on-hit effects outside of, say, like a Command and Conquer and a Brute deck. So why not use the opportunity to potentially play something like an Iron Rock Gauntlet? And I think that's something that's really underexplored, and that's just one example. Brute, you could use Mechanologist as another example that just doesn't really ever get used or talked about, I think. And that's just one piece. I think Home Merchant's Hood is another piece that you could talk about and use some examples of why it's underplayed and how it hasn't been explored. Its use cases, and it probably isn't for every matchup, but there's probably matchups where maybe you want something like a Home Merchant's Hood, or the Vest of the First Fist, like you talked about. All these equipment are still, we've seen maybe like Mage Master Boots see some play, which is great. But yeah, there's some pieces of common equipment that they're probably more specific, I would say. The common equipment outside of something like a Snapdragon Scalers, a lot of the common equipment are a bit more situational, but they're still really strong and still can do a job. I think we just haven't really got to that point in our design and piece as a community of Flesh and Blood yet.
Yeah, I mean, if we call it Runeblade specifically, like Aether Ironweave is definitely an option over Bloodchief Scalata in a lot of strategies. I mean, like the reason why it's been not played as much is because we were in a chain format when it was new and most relevant, and obviously we had Husk back then, which kind of trumped that one because Husk is an incredible piece of equipment.
Yeah, great example. Yeah, there's decks that are playing common equipment still in 1 to 2 slots. I use Ninja, right? Snapdragon Scalers and the Breaking Scales, 2 pieces of common equipment there. And sometimes even playing Hardened Cross Straps, you get like 3 pieces of common / rare equipment, which is great to see. But I think there's other decks that could potentially be doing that. And that's why I always say, people say, oh, if you don't have the legendaries, you can't play these decks. You can't, they're just unplayable. I don't think it's true. It really depends on the strategy, and it varies by hero and class. And yeah, for some, it's going to drastically change the strategy. And you can't just say maybe take a Mask of Momentum and replace it with like a Hope Merchant's Hood and try and play the same plan. That's not going to work, right? Because the Mask of Momentum is really key to a plan that a lot of ninjas want to play. But for instance, okay, I don't have Grasp of the Arknight. Can I still play a similar strategy? Yeah, probably. So it really just depends on what you're trying to do. So I do think the common and rare equipment are kind of underexplored and often just sat to the side when they come out. I've even seen, some decks play like a piece of, like old time decks play a piece of like Ironhide, which I think is quite cool. So, in the league slot, because you have those extra resources on a turn, right? Potentially. So that's really, really cool. You Crown of Seeds, you Rampart, and then at some key point in the game, you Ironhide Boots with your extra resource. So yeah, there's just things that I think we've kind of underexplored so far. But anyway,
I think we all know my opinion on being competitive with budget equipment.
Yeah, you can do it.
Yeah, definitely.
So I wanted to ask you what you think. I want to talk a little bit about how to build around equipment and how to choose equipment, because I think it's really important to like just the fundamentals of equipment. But first of all, I want to ask you, Brennan, what do you think are some of the most important, or like what's in your eyes the best equipment so far that we've had, or the most like successful equipment so far?
Yeah, so it's number one for me is going to probably be Arcanine Skullcap to start, just because blocking and breakpoints have just been very relevant in these previous formats, and also situational Arcane Barrier has been important as well because we've seen a lot of Rune Blades.
Mm-hmm.
So Arcanine Skullcap has been a very dominating piece.
Yep, I think I would have 3 to be honest for me. One of them's common, Snapdragon Scalers. I think that's been one of the most impactful cards we've seen in the game, be it in Constructed, a Class Constructed, or in Blitz. And then it'd be the core pieces so far, and I think this speaks to the power of these generics in Arcanine Skullcap and Fendel Spring Tunic. But I would say that's more around the success side. We've seen those cards in successful decks. I don't actually necessarily think that means that they are the best. If I was to talk about some of what I think is personally the best, then it would be, Scabskin Leathers, Mask of Momentum, and probably Tickler Foundry Heart. I think in my eyes, like 3 of the best equipments. And those are class specific equipments, but they are really, I'm glad they're class specific because they're really, really powerful pieces of equipment.
Yeah, that's interesting. There is some really powerful ones, right? Like Carrying Husk comes to my mind, and so Skullbone Cross Rep is very good in his area as well. Like really, really good. Even though people kind of dog on that class, definitely not me, by the way.
But that like Skullbone Cross Wrap, like in a vacuum, that card is very, very powerful.
It's just nuts.
It's just unfortunate, that maybe you've got New Horizon now and we can't utilize, because that was one of the things I was most excited about with a new Ranger, was like maybe there's finally going to be able to like utilize the power of Skullbone Cross Wrap, but No, we get New Horizon, and it's sort of different game plan with Lexi. But yeah, it's an interesting one. I want to talk about building around equipment. So if you're building a deck or you're building out a strategy, how are you thinking about implementing your equipment? Like, Brendan, are you coming out with like a strategy first, and then you're grabbing your equipment and saying like, this is how it fits in? Or are you identifying that as you go? So I kind of know that I want to be an aggro deck, and I'm really keen on like on-hit effects. So I want some equipment that are going to help me either cause on-hit effects, maybe mask momentum, or I'm thinking about cards that are going to help get me past those breakpoints. So it's like free resources, it's Goliath gauntlets and stuff like this. Like, how do you approach that when you're deck building?
Yeah, it's funny because the answer is definitely both, right? Like, there's a lot of decks that are built around their kind of marquee equipment pieces, but you also add in additional pieces as you sort of define your archetype, right? Like, you might be a ninja deck, and you're like, okay, I'm on Snapdragon Scalers, but maybe I'm switching over to Bracers of Belief, right? Like, I want the plus damage. I go to Skullbone Cross Wrap instead of the Fyendal Spring Tunic, just because I know that my turns aren't going to go so long. So I've built a deck, and then recalibrated and changed my armor to suit my strategy better. But then I've also built decks entirely based off the equipment, right? So like Bloodchief Scalata is a great one to call to there. Of course, Mask of Momentum, like we've said, and then, things like Phantasmal Footsteps as well. And the most important one here, probably the most marquee equipment I think that is built around is probably New Horizon. Because I mean that fundamentally changes like what was one of the most stable things of this game, which was the Arsenal slot, and allows you to have two.
Yep. Yeah, I know, I completely agree. I think for me it's questioning. So I do the same thing. I will build up. I'll do a sort of like a bottom up build, and I'll do a top down build depending on like what it is, what class it is. So sometimes it's like, no, I know that I want to build around this piece of equipment. It's a really integral part of my strategy. Other times it's like, no, I'm building a deck that has a really core goal, and that's really revolved around the cards in the deck. So like I used an example of an aggressive deck before, but it could be something like a control deck with like a lot of defense reactions maybe. And then I'm trying to build, I guess, back from what equipment are going to help me execute on that plan. So in the defensive position, it's like, okay, well, like, I want the highest defense possible in the deck. So it's like playing, Skullcap. I might even be playing a piece of Iron Rot. I'm looking for the class equipment that has 2 to 3 defense. I'm looking for these things. But then the next thing I'm doing when it comes to the role of my equipment is like, then I'm always going to question it. It's like, okay, this is my strategy. As we test and the deck starts to evolve, it's like, these pieces of equipment, could these be something else? So a good example is like during the season with Chain, continue being like, do we actually really want Aether Ironweave in this matchup? And for a while, we just had Aether Ironweave in the deck. And then just going, actually, this is taking up a card slot, and currently the way people are playing, it's not relevant. I'm going to cut this because we're starting to scrutinize our pieces of equipment.
Or it was based off the opposite side where it's like, I get Command and Conquered every freaking game because it's the most popular card in the format. And it's like, exactly. That's really devastating to get hit by that. So like, why don't I just have a free get out of jail card, like a get out of jail free card in the form of Carrion Husk. So yeah, I mean, Aether Ironweave is sick, and your deck is trying to go very fast, but you want to be able to not interact with what your opponent's doing. And if you can just sort of time walk them with the Carrion Husk, it's like you actually end up doing more damage and being more aggressive because of that, because you don't have to defend. So it's an interesting little balance there. Definitely.
And then it's like, so perfect lead into matchup dependency, right? So, maybe the core of my game plan really wants to play these certain 4 equipment. But, how am I going to deal with Arcane? Am I going to deal with that in the form of Spell Void? Am I going to deal with that in the form of Arcane Barrier? How do I want to deal with it? And it's not just, again, it's not an isolation. It's not like, well, I'm worried about Kano, I just chuck in Nulrune 3 or 4. Can my deck actually pay for that? Do I have the resources available? Like, how many blues am I playing? I'm playing 14 blues. Well, Nulrune 3 isn't a very good way to attack that. So why would I need these 3 pieces of equipment that aren't actually going to help me in that game? They're taking up slots. There could be something else. I'm just looking at it in isolation. But maybe Spell Void could be good for my deck because I'm low on resource counts. Or I play Ebb and Fold, and then I play 2 Arcane Barrier, and I can set up a good turn. Or there's lots of different variations you could have on how to do it.
Yeah, I mean, even like we talked about a bit, matchup dependent. So I'm deck dependent as well. As I sideboard in cards to my deck, I may change up my armor as a result of that. So I'm playing Dorinthia. I expect my matches to go longer, so I'm going to actually get most likely more value out of the tunic rather than Courage of Braidhold. I'm not depending on that for a sort of combo. Also, in these longer matches, I've maybe subbed in my Steelblade Shunts, so that one resource on my opponent's turn without having to pitch a card is very, very good now. So, it's all kind of interrelated, but that is sort of, it's a common theme in Flesh and Blood is nothing lives in total isolation. Everything is kind of codependent. But yeah, I mean, there's so many factors you bring into it, right?
Yeah. So I think it's good kind of to wrap that up and move on, but it's like, okay, what's your game plan? How are you sideboarding? Can your deck actually use these equipment functionally and how you want to use them? Are you going bottom up or top down with your equipment? And then also scrutinizing your equipment. Like, are these really the pieces that I should be playing? Often I think at times I go like, okay, I have Tunic. I've taken it for granted. I played Tunic with a few matches. This happens to me a lot in Blitz. And I go, I just wish this was a Vest of the First Fist, or I wish this was a Hardened Cross Strap, because this Tunic is just doing nothing for me in these matchups. So it's just scrutinizing exactly what that's doing. Sometimes I only get one resource out of Tunic. So like Kano is a good example. I think the one resource off Tunic is like so vital that I want that Tunic over anything else. Not that you have many options anyway, but the one defensive value is also important.
I mean, some people play Robe Rapture, which most of the time I disagree with. It's usually for the null rune, but I think that the people that play that robe actually underappreciate how important one resource is in Kano, and it's incredibly important.
Sure. Well, this is a good example on the flip side of that, right? Maybe now Briar starts to creep up in the format, and actually maybe Robo Rapture is the correct one to play against Briar because you don't ever get to a resource on that Tunic, right? So maybe actually, I go second, and on my turn I just pop Robo Rapture, and I just, Kano off the top, or, like a Talismanic Lens, and I have this action point. These 3 resources, and I'm coming off the top of the deck anyway, so I don't need the action point. So like there's different reasons I think to play equipment, and just continually questioning like that. That's something that I've questioned in the past few weeks. Is like, actually, do I just want Robo Rapture against Briar? Like, is that better? So I think that's just one of the best ways to get the most out of your equipment, is to really question, like, is this the correct decision? Am I just taking for granted that I play Skullcap in every deck I build, and I always play Tunic, and et cetera, et cetera?
100% agree.
So we want to close it out. I want to talk a little bit about some of the other just format-specific sort of considerations. So in Blitz, obviously your sideboard is basically your equipment. And I think this is, first of all, one of the best things that LSS have done for introducing how important equipment is to the game and getting people thinking about that. I think this has helped people question when and why to use equipment. I know, like, a good example of this is like Kano just always played Arcanite Skullcap. And then after Blitz, people realized how strong Lens was, right? And so people start playing Lens and Constructed. And you see this with, like, I guess like Skalata, and Blitz was like the first place we saw Skalata, and then it starts to creep over to CC. So we've seen some really cool like crossover there. But also just outside of that, you get 11 pieces for your weapons and your equipment. And this is really important in Blitz. Like, your equipment and how you're going to change your game plan, because your game plan is going to be pretty set. Like, you play in slightly different ways and you use your cards in slightly different ways, but you can't change the cards in your deck. So that 40 is set. But you can change your equipment. Okay, I'm playing Chain, and in some matchups, like, I know I want the Husk. Some matchups, maybe I want the Aether Ironweave. Some matchups, I want the Ebonfold because I want to just be, like, super aggressive and, like, play my deck that way. Other decks I want to play defensively against, and I'm playing, like, the all-block equipment. So that's how you can change your deck up, right? And I think it's important to consider when you're building out your slots for Blitz. Is like, what are each of the pieces doing, and how am I going to change my game plan with the cards in my deck? And that actually goes back to your deck building as well. It goes kind of both ways, right? You start to think about all the pieces of equipment that you have for Blitz, and then it's like, okay, well, if I'm going to play maybe an aggressive plan in one matchup and a defensive plan in another matchup, are some of these cards in my deck, in my 40, not pulling the weight? And do I need to replace these with maybe some more modal cards so that they work in both plans as opposed to only working in one? So just that unison sort of, again, the deck talking to the equipment is really important.
Yeah, I think you summed it up very well, but in Blitz, it really is where you get to be creative with your equipment, right? Because you're not directly trading it out for card slots like you are in Classic Constructed. So we see a lot of variations and a lot of matchup-specific equiment setups.
Yeah, the opportunity cost is less, right? Because you're not sacrificing.
Zero, right?
Yeah,
it's just because we're at 11 on the slot right now. I mean, in the future, it'll probably be interesting as you kind of think about all the different pieces that you could include. But right now, it's like, you're not taking the opportunity cost of having more cards in your deck or something like that. You're just having 11 slots.
Right, it'll be different in the future, right? Because it'll be the opportunity cost of other equipment. Whereas comparing Blitz to Classic Constructed, it's like, in Classic Constructed, it's like, okay, well, I can't fit these 3 Favor Scenes in for this matchup because I want this ebb and fold for one matchup, or I want this Hope Merchant's Hood for one matchup, or whatever it is. So whereas in Blitz, it's like, well, I have these slots, like where are my slots best used? Like these are basically my sideboard cards. So yeah, it's really interesting. Because we're talking about equipment, I think one thing I wanted to touch on, because this is a question that comes up a lot and is something that I've sort of debate, is in Limited, when do you draft equipment? And why do you draft
every
equipment?
time? It's so good. It's just a persistent board state effect. Like, obviously not all equipment is created equal, but I mean, usually the equipment pieces are very good, but even if they're not, it's just a piece of your deck that you're guaranteed to see. Like, you don't have to draw it, right? Like, it's going to be there. You know, if you're not able to get through your entire deck, 100, like, zero variance, like, you're going to be able to play it, and sometimes it will have, like, a persistent effect on the actual board, the entire game, right? If you think about something like, I know this one is a legendary, but tectonic plating, you can utilize that many times. Like, Mask of Momentum can be utilized many times throughout the thing. And there's a lot of other examples. But even these ones that are kind of one pops, they're so good. Especially, I mean, coming out of the Tales of Aria format, that was definitely a format where equipment was extremely first pickable, right? Because it was the only thing. I think it was the only thing that didn't commit you to anything, right?
Yeah, apart from the
kind of committed you.
Entwine
Yeah.
cards, but yeah, and some are talent specific. But yeah, so this is the importance of equipment. There's one really good example I like to use when people say, like, why would I draft equipment high in Limited? Why is it important? It's not a card in my deck. Here's a good example I like to use. Let's take Goliath Gauntlets. So you have a Goliath Gauntlet, it's your only piece of equipment. Your opponent has no pieces of equipment. You have, 2 damage sitting on the board already before the game even starts. Your opponent is starting at, you wouldn't say they're effectively starting at 2 less, but you have 2 damage right there, which is, it's not a small amount of their life total, right? So you get to already come into play with that, which is huge. It's, it's 10% of their life total. Like, it's not nothing. And I think it's a good example of why equipment is so important. It's not about why take equipment high. It's about, like, if you have a good set of equipment, what advantage are you getting to that? Or if you don't, what disadvantage are you at? And constructed, right? Everyone shows up with equipment. You have 4 slots. That's given. But in Limited, it's not. So if you don't have equipment and your opponent does, you're at a disadvantage. If you do have equipment and your opponent doesn't, you're at an advantage. But it comes down to what's the opportunity cost of these. So if I'm taking an early piece of equipment, maybe it is the Goliath Gauntlets. What am I missing out on? If I'm first picking it over a generic card like a Snatch, that might have like a really high cost to it, right? Because a card like Snatch could go in any deck. It's very powerful. It's very versatile. Whereas if I'm or Scarf, for instance, is maybe even a better example in Welcome to Wraith. But if I'm taking that over maybe, a red or yellow Smash Instinct at pack 1, pick 1, the cost is lower because that Smash Instinct is not guaranteed to make it into whatever deck I play. And maybe it's not as fundamental a card, and the equipment is just going to be better value for me in the game.
Yeah. I think if the counter argument was it's not a card in my deck, I would love for, like, a lot of the cards to not be in my deck and just to be persistent on the board. That would be ridiculous.
Exactly.
Like, it doesn't get much better, like, than just having it just always there, right? It's almost like having another card in your hand that just says does +2 damage or does this effect. So it's huge. Yeah,
and they can also give you effects that your deck wouldn't be able to provide. Like a Snapdragon Scalers can provide a piece of, an extra action point at some point in the game that you just could push you over the top. That your deck, that you might have to draft like a timestamp potion. You have to find these cards that have go again, whereas you just have Snapdragon Scales. A great example of this is Deep Blue. Deep Blue in this current Tales of Aria draft format.
It's just the best card ever printed.
It's a card that allows you to do so many things. It smooths out inconsistencies, invariance when you draw all red hands. It allows you to pump some really, really powerful hands because you get extra resources. It allows you to, like, tuck cards to the bottom to save for later, like worst case. This piece of equipment goes into every deck, and it does something on the board that can always be beneficial, almost always be beneficial. So it's except when you're trying to swing a Titan's Fist, I guess. It's such a good example of why equipment are important, and sometimes they're underrated, right? Because it's like, but this, like, I have this attack action I could take, but I guess the value of that card not being in your hand is the thing that people should always come back to. That card is, that piece of equipment isn't in your hand. That Crackerjacks isn't sat in your hand. It's set on the board as a persistent effect that can always be used.
Persistent effects are not common in Flesh and Blood.
Yeah, sorry, not
and
persistent, but
no, but like that's no, I'm saying it's like equipment. So like something that persists and on the board state and just starts there in the game, is not very common, right? You have with Dash, and if we're not talking about doesn't start in the not at the start of the game, right? But just persistent board states in general. Like you think about something like Mechanologist to work extremely hard to get that out, right? Like has to work extremely hard for the induction chambers, the plasma purifiers, or even some of the other miscellaneous items. This just starts. There's no cost, right? The cost is that you can't have more of them. You can only have 4. You can only have the slots that are in your armor. It's very, very good. And in limited, it can give you a massive edge.
Yep, it's like why Winter's Wail is like so strong in this format, right? Because it has a persistent, it's a weapon that's an upgrade on the current weapon, and you get to leverage that multiple times in a game. So the incremental value is huge.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, I did want to talk a bit about what do we see for the future of equipment in Flesh and Blood, but I think we kind of talked about that when we talked about Everfest and what we could see. So unless you have kind of any last sort of philosophical thoughts about equipment in Flesh and Blood and what you expect to see in the future, I think we'll kind of wrap up our equipment and the importance of equipment in Flesh and Blood pod.
I'm just interested to hear everybody else's speculations. Shoot us a comment below what you expect to see in Everfest. It's huge, right? If we see something similar to Crucible where we get a large amount of new equipment, it's going to change the game massively for years to come, right? Like we saw some of this Crucible equipment not be utilized for quite a while, specifically Bloodsheath Skeletta. But what is the next stage of equipment? What is the next batch that we're going to get? I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I actually think we're getting legendary weapons. Which we did talk about at the very beginning of the pod, but I'm gonna go out there and that's gonna be my call for the next set is that we actually get legendary weapons.
All right, you heard it here first.
Yeah, you heard it here first.
I like your predictions, Brendan. So that's going to wrap up the importance of equipment in Flesh and Blood pod. I think this is going to serve as a pretty fundamental piece in the Arsenal Pass pod repertoire. Just want to say before we go, thank you to all of our listeners, all of our viewers on YouTube. If you do like us, as we said, drop us a like, drop us a subscribe, leave us a review on iTunes or any podcast services that you do use. It helps us get out there to more people as we push, and we want to grow this game that we love, and so we think that we can help do that. Did also want to say we are on Twitter. Brendan is at BrendanAPG, and I am at FianDale. That's Fian_Dale. Come and drop us a line, drop us a question for the Command and Cookout. We love interacting on Twitter, so. Also, just thank you to our patrons. We are so grateful for your support. It allows us to continue to keep doing the work that we're doing, putting out this content on YouTube, our extra content, our extra deck guides, etc. And it's allowed us also to bring on some support to the team as well in the form of editors and community managers. So thank you so much. But until next time, we'll speak to you in the next episode.